She didn't see it coming. Nobody ever does. One moment Sharon Ellis was standing in the middle of her own living room, the Manhattan penthouse she had decorated with her own hands, chosen every frame, every cushion, every warm light fixture that made the place feel like a home, and the next moment, her husband was looking at her like she was a stranger who had wandered into the wrong apartment. His name was Derek Cole. Polished. Successful. The kind of man who always said the right thing at the right time and made everyone in the room feel like they were the only person he was talking to. Sharon had believed every word he ever said to her. Every single one. She had been sitting at her desk reviewing documents when she heard the elevator open directly into their penthouse. She heard his voice. Then she heard something that stopped her breath completely, another voice. Female. Unhurried. Comfortable in a way that told Sharon everything she needed to know before she even stood up from that chair. She walked into the living room and stopped. The woman standing beside Derek was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in an outfit that cost more than most people's rent. She looked at Sharon the way people look at furniture they're planning to replace. Sharon's voice came out steady because she was that kind of woman. Derek. Just his name. Just that. Who is she? Derek set his keys on the marble counter without looking at his wife. Her name is Vanessa. He adjusted his cufflink. And you need to leave. The room dropped 10 degrees. Excuse me. I'm not going to say it twice, Sharon. Collect what you need for tonight. The rest will be sent to you. He finally looked at her then, and what she saw in his eyes was worse than anger. It was nothing. Absolute, deliberate nothing. This is my house. I need you gone. Sharon stood there for 3 full seconds. Not from weakness. From the pure, devastating shock of watching 6 years of your life collapse in under 60 seconds. She picked up her coat from the chair by the door. She didn't grab a bag. She didn't say another word. She walked to that elevator and she pressed the button and she stood with her back straight and her jaw set and her eyes burning but dry, completely dry, until the doors closed behind her. And then she fell apart. The New York streets were wet and cold and indifferent the way only New York streets can be at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Sharon walked without direction. She wasn't watching where she was going. She was somewhere inside herself, trying to find a single piece of solid ground that hadn't just been pulled out from under her feet. She didn't see the black vehicle until it was too late. The tires screamed. The impact was sudden and total, and then the ground came up and the city lights smeared into nothing and Sharon Ellis felt everything go completely, absolutely dark. If you're watching this right now, I need 30 seconds of your time. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this one, about women who were thrown away and became unstoppable, deserve to be heard all the way to the end. Like this video, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Sharon, because what happened next will change everything you think you know about this story. The man who stepped out of that black vehicle was not the kind of man who stopped for anyone. His name was Caruso. Just Caruso. Nobody in New York used his first name. Nobody in New York was comfortable enough to try. He was broad-shouldered and dark-eyed and moved with the quiet, total authority of a man who had never once in his adult life been told no. Intricate black tattoos climbed the full length of his neck. More covered both his hands, dark, detailed, permanent, the kind that told a story most people wouldn't survive hearing. He stood over Sharon's unconscious body on that wet Manhattan street and said nothing for a long moment. His driver was already talking. "Sir, we need to go. We cannot be seen here." Caruso crouched down. He looked at this woman lying broken and alone on a cold New York street. Something moved through him that he couldn't name and didn't try to. "Get the car door," he said quietly. Now. Nobody argued with Caruso. Nobody ever did. You need to understand who Sharon Ellis was before that night. Because what Derek Cole did to her was not just a betrayal. It was the deliberate destruction of one of the finest women you will ever hear about. Sharon was born and raised in Washington, D.C. The only daughter of Gerald and May Ellis, two people who had built everything they owned from nothing and poured every drop of that same relentless spirit into their daughter. Gerald was a quiet, deeply principled man who worked 30 years as a civil engineer and never once raised his voice in anger. May was warmth and fire in equal measure, the kind of mother who could comfort you and challenge you in the same breath without ever making you feel small. Sharon grew up understanding that excellence was not optional. Not as pressure. As love. As the language her parents used to say, you are worth every good thing this world has to offer. She graduated top of her class at the University of Connecticut. Then came Columbia Law School in New York, 3 of the most demanding, most extraordinary years of her life. She came out the other side sharper than a blade and twice as composed. She joined one of Manhattan's most respected firms at 27 and built her reputation the way she built everything, steadily, intentionally, without shortcuts. That was where Derek Cole found her. He was a real estate developer. The kind who got his photograph in magazines and his name on buildings. He walked into her firm for a contract consultation on a Thursday afternoon, and by Friday morning he had asked her to dinner. Sharon said no. She said no the second time too. The third time, he showed up at her office with coffee, no flowers, no performance, just coffee exactly the way she took it, which meant he had paid attention, and said simply, I would very much like to get to know you properly. If you'll allow it. She allowed it. Their first year was everything she had ever quietly hoped for. Derek was present. Generous. Genuinely curious about her mind in a way that made Sharon feel like she was finally standing in front of someone who actually saw her, not her looks, not her success, but the precise specific person she actually was underneath all of it. He met Gerald and May in D.C. on a Sunday afternoon. Gerald shook his hand and studied him with those quiet, measuring eyes and said very little, which was how Gerald showed he was paying close attention. May made her famous lemon pound cake and asked Derek 3 questions that sounded casual and were absolutely not. That evening, after Derek had gone, May sat beside her daughter on the porch and said softly, he's impressive, baby. But impressive and trustworthy are 2 very different things. Watch what he does when he thinks nobody is watching. Sharon tucked those words somewhere deep. And in those early years, everything Derek showed her seemed to confirm that she had chosen wisely. They married in a ceremony in Connecticut, small and warm and full of the kind of genuine joy that only comes from people who actually mean what they're celebrating. Gerald walked his daughter down the aisle and held himself together right up until the music started, and then he didn't hold together at all, and nobody in that room loved him any less for it. But somewhere in the 3rd year of marriage, something began to shift. Derek started staying later at the office. Then his phone was always face down, always silenced, always somehow just out of reach. Sharon noticed the small things first because Sharon Ellis was a lawyer and lawyers noticed everything. The slight change in the scent of his jacket. The new restaurant charge on their joint account at a place he never mentioned visiting. The way he laughed differently on certain phone calls, looser, warmer, in a way he hadn't laughed with her in months. One night she sat across from him at their dinner table and said calmly, Derek. Is there something you need to tell me? He looked up from his phone. You're tired, Sharon. You've been working too hard. She held his gaze steadily. That's not an answer. He set his phone face down on the table and smiled, and the smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. I love you. Stop creating problems that don't exist. She said nothing more that night. But she didn't sleep either. What she didn't know, what she had absolutely no way of seeing from inside the life she had built with him, was that Derek Cole had been with Vanessa for 14 months. 14 months of lies so smooth and so consistent that Sharon, one of the sharpest legal minds in Manhattan, had never found a single visible crack. Until the night he stopped trying to hide it. Until the night he brought Vanessa home. Until the night that black vehicles' tires screamed on a wet Manhattan street, and the most feared man in New York City stepped out into the rain and changed everything. Sharon woke up not knowing where she was. The ceiling above her was white and clean and very still. The room was quiet in a way that felt expensive. Soft light came through tall windows. There was a faint smell of something medicinal underneath something warmer, cedar, maybe, or something close to it. Her body felt like it had argued with something much larger than itself and lost decisively. She tried to sit up. Pain stopped her immediately. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Please don't try to move yet. You have 2 fractured ribs and a concussion. You need to stay still. Sharon looked at her. Where am I? You're safe, the nurse said. Then she added, with a very specific kind of carefully neutral tone, Mr. Caruso arranged everything. Sharon had no idea who Mr. Caruso was. She found out 3 hours later when the door opened and he walked in. He was taller than she expected. Broader. He moved through the doorway like the room had been waiting for him to arrive. Dark suit. No tie. The tattoos on his neck were unmistakable, intricate, deliberate, climbing from his collar like something alive. His hands, resting at his sides, carried the same dark ink. His eyes were brown and deep and completely unreadable in a way that made Sharon feel like she was looking at something that had survived things most people would never imagine. He stopped near the foot of her bed. She looked at him directly. Because Sharon Ellis had never looked away from anything in her life and she was not about to start now. "You're the one whose car hit me," she said. Something shifted almost invisibly in his expression. "Yes. And you brought me here." "Yes. And you paid for all of this." "Yes." She studied him for a long, careful moment. "Why?" Caruso looked at her steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do." Sharon tilted her head slightly, that precise, lawyerly tilt that meant she was processing something several layers deeper than the surface. "Men like you don't usually stop," she said quietly. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. "I'm not most men." The room was completely still between them. Not uncomfortable. Not tense. Just honest in a way Sharon hadn't felt in a very long time. "Sharon Ellis," she said finally. "I know," he said. And that should have unsettled her. But somehow, it didn't. What happened over the next 3 weeks was something neither of them planned and neither of them fully understood while it was happening. Caruso came every morning before the rest of the world was fully awake. He didn't stay long. He didn't make speeches. He checked that everything she needed had been handled, and it always had been, because nothing in Caruso's world was ever left unhandled, and then he sat in the chair beside the window and was simply present in that room in a way that felt, to a woman who had spent years feeling invisible inside her own marriage, like something close to oxygen. His associate, a sharp and loyal man named James who had worked beside Caruso for 12 years, pulled him aside in the corridor one morning and said bluntly, "Boss. Who is this woman to you?" Caruso straightened the cuff of his jacket. "Someone who needed help." James looked at him with the careful eyes of a man who knew his boss better than almost anyone alive. "You've never done this before." "I'm doing it now." Caruso met his gaze evenly. "That's enough." James said nothing more. But he watched. And he noticed that something in the man he had known for over a decade had shifted in a way that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the woman in room 4. Meanwhile, back in Manhattan, Derek Cole had received news of the accident through a mutual contact. He was sitting in the penthouse, Sharon's penthouse, the one she had made beautiful with her own hands, when his phone rang with the information. He listened. He set the phone down. And he went back to his evening without making a single call. He didn't ask which hospital. He didn't get in his car. He didn't feel anything, because in Derek Cole's mind, Sharon had already been erased. She was a closed chapter. A solved problem. What he did instead was pick up the phone and call his attorney. "I want the divorce filed by end of week," he said flatly. Fast and clean. The attorney asked no questions. He simply began. But Derek didn't stop there. And what he did next, what he chose to do deliberately, calculatingly, to a woman lying broken in a hospital bed, was the thing that would ultimately cost him everything. Sharon was discharged on a Thursday morning in October. The New York air was sharp and clean and the sky was the particular shade of cold blue that the city only produces in autumn. She stood outside the hospital entrance and breathed it in slowly, the first real outdoor air she'd had in 3 weeks, and felt the weight of everything she was walking back into settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Caruso was standing beside the car. She looked at him. "You didn't have to come." "I know," he said. And opened the door. He had already spoken with her parents, something Sharon learned only later, something that made Gerald Ellis, a man of very few emotional displays, go quiet for a long time before he said simply, "That man has character." He drove her to her parents' home in Connecticut himself, sitting beside her in the back of the vehicle while the New York skyline shrank behind them and the highway opened up ahead. Sharon watched the road through the window and didn't speak for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Did Derek call the hospital at all?" Caruso was still for just a moment. "No. One word. But it landed with the full weight of everything it meant. Sharon nodded slowly. She turned back to the window. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry. But something behind them, something deep and structural, cracked very quietly and very permanently in that moment. Her parents were waiting at the front door. May came down those porch steps before the car had fully stopped, moving with the urgent, unstoppable energy of a mother who had been terrified for weeks and was only now allowing herself to feel it. Baby. Her voice broke completely on that single word. Sharon stepped out of the car and walked straight into her mother's arms, and May held her daughter the way you hold something you almost lost, completely, fiercely, without any restraint at all. Gerald appeared in the doorway. He walked down slowly. He put one large steady hand on his daughter's back and said nothing at all. He didn't need to. Sharon felt it all in that hand, every prayer, every sleepless night, every piece of love that word couldn't carry. She closed her eyes and let herself be held. Caruso stood beside the car and watched. He had intended to leave immediately. He had 100 things requiring his attention. He had an entire city that answered to him and a schedule that didn't accommodate sentiment. He stood there for 4 minutes before he moved toward the house. Gerald looked up and noticed him. He walked over, extended his hand with the quiet dignity of a man who had never in his life led with anything less than respect, and said, "I don't know who you are, sir. But you brought my daughter home. And I owe you more than I know how to say." Caruso shook his hand. Held his gaze. "Gerald Ellis," he said, because he already knew. "Come inside," Gerald said. It was not a question. Caruso glanced at James standing by the vehicle. Then he followed Gerald Ellis through that front door. And without either of them knowing it yet, that was the moment this story truly changed direction. Inside, over coffee at the kitchen table, while Sharon rested down the hall, Gerald told Caruso everything. The divorce filing. The attorney. And then the thing that made Caruso's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly: Derek Cole had come to this house. Had sat at this very table. Had looked two loving parents in the face and told them their daughter had been unfaithful. That the marriage had ended because of her choices. Gerald's voice was completely steady as he said it. Caruso was still in the way that dangerous men go still when they are deciding something. When Gerald finished, Caruso set down his cup. "Does she know any of this?" Gerald shook his head slowly. "Not yet. She needs to hear it from you," Caruso said. "Not from anyone else. And not until she's stronger." Gerald studied this man, the tattoos, the authority, the careful controlled way he spoke about his daughter's well-being. "You're not what I expected," he said. Caruso looked at him evenly. "Most people aren't." The next morning, Sharon found out everything. She sat in the living room between her parents and listened to every word without interrupting. The divorce papers. The lies Derek had told to her parents' faces. The attorney. The boxes of her belongings already packed and waiting. She sat completely still through all of it, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed with the practiced control of a woman who had spent a career keeping herself steady in rooms designed to break her. But her eyes. Her eyes filled slowly until the tears came quietly, one after another, without drama, without sound, like rain on glass. May reached over and took both her hands. "You did nothing wrong," May whispered. "Nothing, baby." Sharon nodded. But the question she kept asking herself, the one that lived in the silence behind all the others, was not about fault. It was simpler than that. And it hurt far more. How did I not see it? Caruso didn't disappear. That was the thing that surprised Sharon most. Men like him, powerful, feared, belonging entirely to a world that operated on a completely different set of rules than the one she inhabited, men like him didn't stay. They handled situations and they moved on. It was the nature of who they were. But Caruso stayed. He came back the next day. And the day after that. He never made an entrance. He simply appeared, at the door, at the kitchen table, on the porch where Sharon sometimes sat with her coffee in the mornings when the Connecticut air was cold enough to see her breath. He never pushed. He never performed. He was simply, consistently, unmovably present in a way that Sharon's entire 6-year marriage had failed to be. He started taking care of things without announcing it. The heating system in her parents' house that had been making a strange sound for weeks was repaired by two men who arrived early one morning and left before lunch without presenting a single bill. Groceries appeared at the door. A specialist was arranged for Sharon's follow-up appointments, a specialist at Massachusetts General, one of the finest in the country, with no discussion and no fuss. May opened the door one afternoon to find Caruso standing there with bags of food and said, "Caruso, you don't have to keep doing this." He looked at her with those steady, unreadable dark eyes. "I know," he said simply. "I want to." May studied him for a long moment, this feared and powerful and tattooed man standing at her front door with grocery bags. Then she stepped aside and let him in. Because May Ellis had always known that the truest thing you could learn about a person was not what they said. It was what they kept showing up to do. Sharon was at the kitchen table one evening, deep in the legal documents she'd returned to, because Sharon Ellis did not stop building her life for anyone, not even grief, when Caruso sat across from her and opened his own work. They stayed that way for 2 hours. Two serious, driven, deeply capable people working in a silence that felt, to both of them, like the most natural thing in the world. Sharon looked up once and caught him watching her. Not the way men usually watched her. Not with calculation or desire or the particular measuring quality she had learned to recognize and deflect over years of being an attractive successful woman in competitive rooms. He was watching her with something unguarded and almost uncertain, which on a man who was never uncertain about anything looked completely foreign and absolutely genuine at the same time. "What?" she said quietly. He looked away briefly. "Nothing," he said. But it wasn't nothing. They both knew it wasn't nothing. It was 3 weeks later on a cold California evening. Sharon had traveled for a case. Caruso had appeared, characteristically, without much explanation, that he finally said what had been living inside him for longer than he was comfortable admitting. They were standing on the balcony of her hotel, the Los Angeles skyline glittering below them, the ocean a dark suggestion in the distance. "Sharon." His voice was lower than usual. Careful in the way of a man who almost never needed to be careful with words. "I need to say something. And I need you to let me finish before you respond." She turned to face him fully. "I'm listening." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that comes before something real. "I have been in rooms with the most dangerous people alive and never once lost control of anything," he said. "And then I am in a room with you, and I don't know what to do with that." He held her gaze completely. "I have fallen in love with you. I know what that word costs you right now. I know what you've been through. I'm not asking you for anything tonight." He exhaled slowly. "I just needed you to know the truth." The California night was completely still around them. Sharon looked at this man, complicated, powerful, quietly devoted, nothing like anyone she had ever imagined for herself, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt safe. "I told myself I would never do this again," she said finally. Her voice was quiet but completely steady. "That I would never hand someone a piece of me that nearly didn't survive last time." She looked out at the city lights for a moment. Then back at him. "But the truth is, Caruso, I have been feeling this for longer than I want to admit. And I have been afraid of it for every single day of that time." She exhaled. "I love you too." Something moved across his face. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just real, the quiet, deep arrival of something a man like Caruso had spent his entire life not knowing he was waiting for. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he reached across and took her hand. And Sharon Ellis didn't pull away. They dated the way two people date when they have both survived enough to know exactly what matters. Slowly. Honestly. Without performance or pretense. Long dinners in quiet restaurants in New York where nobody bothered them because nobody who valued their evening bothered anyone associated with Caruso. Long drives up the Connecticut coast where they talked about everything, her career, his world, her parents, the future, the particular kind of life you build when you've already had the wrong one and know the difference. He took her to Washington, D.C. to meet Gerald and May for a proper dinner, and sat at that table for 3 hours, and answered every one of Gerald's careful questions directly and without deflection. When Gerald walked him to the door that evening and shook his hand, he said quietly, "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what kind of man you are, Caruso. But I know what kind of man you've been to my daughter. And that tells me more than anything else." Caruso looked at him. I will spend the rest of my life making sure she never questions her worth again. Gerald held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, that slow, final, absolute nod that meant a man of Gerald Ellis's character was satisfied. Sharon's law career caught fire in the months that followed. She made partner at her New York firm at 34, the youngest in the firm's history, a fact that her colleagues announced with the kind of reverent enthusiasm that meant they had watched her earn every single inch of it. She walked into that office every morning like a woman who had been through the worst storm of her life and come out knowing exactly how strong she was. Because she did know. Derek Cole's world, meanwhile, was collapsing in precise and poetic increments. It started with the business. A financial audit, triggered by a partner who had grown suspicious of numbers that never fully added up, uncovered systematic fraud in the company accounts. Millions moved quietly over 3 years. Spent on Vanessa. Spent on the luxury of a lie that required constant and expensive maintenance. The legal exposure was catastrophic. His attorney, the same expensive Manhattan lawyer he had used to file Sharon's divorce papers, to dismantle her life with cold efficiency, could not build a wall high enough this time. The night Derek was arrested, he did what men like Derek always do when the floor gives way. He called Vanessa. She didn't answer. He called again. Silence. He sent messages that disappeared into the void of a woman who had already made her calculations and moved on to the next comfortable arrangement. The woman he had chosen over his wife. The woman he had humiliated Sharon in front of, in the hallway of the home Sharon had made beautiful, that woman had never loved him. She had simply used him until he had nothing left to offer, and then set him down without a backward glance. His penthouse was seized. His assets frozen. His name removed from the buildings that bore it. And Derek Cole, who had once looked Sharon Ellis in the face and told her to leave like she was nothing, sat in a cold cell with nothing but time and the unbearable, crushing weight of every choice he had ever made. 6 months after that California balcony, on a rooftop in Manhattan with the entire glittering New York skyline spread out below them and the Hudson catching the last of the evening light, Caruso reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a ring. Sharon's breath stopped completely. It was extraordinary. Not loud, not excessive, simply a diamond so precisely chosen that it caught the city light and held it like it had been waiting its whole existence to sit on the finger of exactly this woman. He didn't drop to one knee dramatically. He simply held it out to her and said, "Build this life with me, Sharon. For real. Forever." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. And then she laughed, a real, full, completely unguarded laugh that started in her chest and took over everything, the laugh of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side and was genuinely, completely, overwhelmingly happy. "Yes," she said. "Forever." Gerald Ellis cried at the wedding. He stood at the top of that aisle in a church in Connecticut and held his daughter's arm and cried before they had taken a single step, and not one person in that room thought anything less of him for it. May sat in the front row in a gown the color of champagne and pressed her hand to her heart and closed her eyes like she was saying a prayer she'd been holding for years. Sharon was radiant. Not in the fragile, hoping way she had been the first time. In the way of a woman who had chosen consciously, completely, with every piece of herself wide open and unafraid, who had been broken and had healed and had decided without reservation that she deserved every extraordinary thing life was offering her. She did. Caruso stood at that altar and watched his bride walk toward him, and for the first time in his life, the most feared man in New York City looked like exactly what he was in that moment, a man who had been handed something he would spend every day of his life protecting. The woman Derek Cole threw out into a cold New York night. The woman who landed. The woman who rose. The queen who had been inside Sharon Ellis the entire time, waiting for someone worthy enough to finally recognize her. She was never going back. Not even for a single breath. Not even once. If this story moved you, if you felt every chapter the way it was meant to be felt, then you already know what to do. Subscribe. Turn on that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the wrong person leaving is sometimes the most beautiful thing that ever happens to you. There is an episode 2. And what comes next for Sharon and Caruso will leave you completely speechless.